Okay, everybody. So, yes, this week we're going to do one of these presentations like this on Shakespeare and the whole kind of issue of gender, basically dividing it into three subtopics. The first one is, was Shakespeare gay and should we care? I mean, does it matter if a writer's gay or not? And what's that got to do with what they wrote? The second one is Shakespeare's attitude towards women. I mean, there are feminist critics who will attack Shakespeare and say he was kind of a woman hater, a misogynist, and there are others who will say perhaps, depending on how we interpret it, or perhaps in different plays, he comes across differently in his attitude towards women. And finally, just looking a little bit more generally at the picture of women in early modern England and what it was like to be a woman and how people thought about women in that period. You're probably sort of thinking, "Sonnani kawaranai, things don't change, do they?" But actually, you know, things do change an awful lot. I mean, if you think about it, just 100 years ago, none of you women would have been here. Shakespeare is 400 years ago. Okay, things definitely were different. Okay, so let's take each of those topics in turn. The issue of Shakespeare's sexuality. We've got this on the print here. I'll read it through as he originally wrote it, and then I'll give you a sort of translation into modern English, okay, so you can understand a little bit. As he wrote it, it's a woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change, as is false woman's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false in rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, much steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use, their treasure. Okay, so to try to understand that a little bit, here it is an attempt to put it into modern English. Before I do that, just take a look at some of the phrases there. The master mistress of my passion, all right, in the second line. Master mistress, obviously tremendous amount of sexual ambiguity there. And the bottom there, since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure. To prick out is it's a gardening thing. I don't know if any of you have ever done any gardening, but especially in the hatake, you know, when you're planting seeds, you might put 100 seeds in a little box this big with some earth. All right, and they all grow up, but of course they're much too close together. You have to prick them out and plant them separately. So pricking them out means choosing them out, choosing them, selecting each one and putting it in its place. Nature pricked thee out. Nature chose you. But, I'm sorry, this is kind of embarrassing, but I don't know if you know modern English slang. In modern English slang, a prick is a penis. And I was very surprised to know that Shakespeare used the same word in the same way. I thought it was, as I say, modern English slang. But it's not. Okay? He's obviously using the word to catch the double meaning of a prick, a penis. Nature gave you a penis. All right? It's very simple, just sort of, okay, basic expression. All right? So let's go through the poem little bit by little bit. You, the master mistress of my passion, you have a woman's face painted with nature's own hand. You have the gentle heart of a woman, but you do not know the shifting change that is common with false women. You're not like women who are false, and although you have the same gentle heart as a woman, you're not like those women who are false and deceive and trick people. Your eye is brighter than theirs. Okay, it makes it clear that this person is not a woman. This person must be a man. It's definitely talking to a man. Your eye is brighter than theirs, but not as falsely roving. It lights up the objects that it looks upon. You are a man in appearance, one who controls all others, one who catches the attention of men and the souls of women. Everybody notices you. When you walk into the room, heads turn, men and women. You were made to be a woman until nature, as she made you, and nature is heterosexual, okay? Nature has fallen in love and thinks, oh, I can't. As nature is a female, I can't make this female because then, I can't have heterosexual love. Nature has fallen in love with this person, so it says, has to be a man. Because nature, she, has fallen in love, and therefore makes this person male. Okay, so nature, as she made you, fell in love with you, and since she fell in love with you, she made it impossible for me to win you by adding something quite unsuitable for my purpose. Somebody, what we just said, a penis. Nature gave you that little bit. It is to my purpose nothing. Okay, it's unsuitable for my purpose. But since she chose you to be for the pleasure of women, may your love be for me, even if the act of loving you is for them. So it would seem, he's very careful and very clever in the way that he expresses this. It's clear that he has admiration and affection, physically even, for this person, for this man. But he's saying, okay, you go and have sex with women, but the real kind of spiritual friendship is between us. And of course, this was very much what Plato said, Platon. Okay, this is, and the early modern period was obsessed with Plato. Okay, the real love is between men, but it's spiritual, or it's supposed to be. That was the idea. Okay, it's not supposed to be sexual. That was so you go and sleep with women, but have your real love with me. It seems to be the way that he ends up. Okay, now, why do I pick a sonnet? Well, there's a reason for that. Let's just go back and look at it again so you can see it. You've got them both on your print, so you can see them both together. The modern version, or translation, and the poem as it was originally written. I'll just say before I move on that the sonnet we looked at in the first lesson, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, is also considered to have been written to the same man. And people often think of it as a love poem between a man, from a man to a woman, and it could be. But it's often considered that it was written as part of the same group of sonnets that were written to a man. So, okay, why would we particularly look at a sonnet as being a guide to Shakespeare's sexuality? Well, one of the reasons is because the sonnets were published without his permission. Before that, they'd gone around among his friends, and he'd shown them to his friends, and his friends would sort of smile and talked about it and enjoyed them. But he didn't publish them himself. They were published outside his own control. So there's a feeling that perhaps they are expressing what he really felt and who he really was, and that if he'd been given the choice, he would have changed them, or maybe not published all of them, or So there's a feeling that perhaps he said more than he would have chosen to say. So that's why people often look at the sonnets when they want to figure out, where Shakespeare's really coming from. We've got 154 sonnets, and most of them, the first 126, appear to be addressed to this same man. And it's really hard, isn't it, to tell whether that's platonic or whether it's sexual. All right? I mean, when he says, well, you've got that bit that's no good to me, it's a bit like saying, I would love you if you were a woman, but you're not. Okay? So he's kind of careful not to cross that line, which would have been taboo in his day. All right? He could have found himself in definite trouble if he had crossed that line. It's a little bit like the whole debate about whether he's a Catholic or not. Okay? If he had openly talked about being a Catholic, or if he'd openly talked about being gay, he would have definitely been in trouble in those days. They're dedicated to someone with the initials WH, and there are two possible candidates. One would be Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, and the other would be William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. They were both patrons. Patrons in the meaning they were both people who supported Shakespeare. It was typical for people to support artists. I mean, how are they going to live? They have rich patrons who say, write a poem for me, William, and I will pay you. Or, I loved your play the other day. Here's some money to help you to write the next one. Okay, so patrons, rich people who saw it as part of their duty to society to support artists. All right? But of course, again, that creates an interesting possibility for the relationship. How close were those relationships on some occasions? So there's speculation. Here they are. All right? This is Henry Wriothesley. All right, as you can see, a rather florid young man, and William Herbert. Okay, these are the two main candidates that perhaps he was writing to one of those. Okay. All right, so that's the way that goes in terms of what he says about himself or his own sexual, his own sexual feelings or expressing attraction towards men. So what does it leave us with? Was he gay? Well, as I say, it would be taboo for him to say so openly. So again, just like the Catholic thing, we can't really know. And there are plenty of passages, especially in the sonnets, but also in his other works, that do imply a kind of attraction to men. But it's not clear, where the line is between homosexuality and homosocial bonding. There's a sort of spiritual connection, the friendship, the matiness, all right? Where the line exists changes in different cultures, all right? I mean, you could go to a hot spring in Japan and you're surrounded by naked people of the same sex, all right? But nobody considers that you're gay because of it, all right? It would, but in other cultures, you would never, that would never happen, all right? So the exact line could be different for different societies, but Shakespeare is ambiguous about this, so that there's not really any possibility to say, well, that's obvious what he's talking about there. Okay, I mean, that sonnet 20 is about as close as it gets, but even then, it's not 100% clear. But of course, even poetry, those sonnets may not be a guide to what he really thinks and feels. I mean, when he writes in his plays when Hamlet talks about suicide, we don't suppose that Shakespeare's suicidal, do we? It's a fiction. And poetry was very often a sort of exercise. You know, people would write love poems even if they didn't have a woman that they were in love, or a man, or whatever. Even if they didn't have someone that they were in love with, they would write a love poem because it was a kind of fashion. You know? And I think that still happens, okay? I mean, my daughter's 18 years old, and she writes pop songs and sings them. All about relationships and things that she's never had. Okay? And people do this, don't they? All right? So, you know, you don't have to suppose that just because it's in a song or in a poem or in a, you know, piece of fiction, you don't have to suppose that there's any truth behind it. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything very much at all. And anyway, what does it matter? I don't think it matters. You know, in terms of literature, it doesn't matter whether he was Catholic or Protestant. It doesn't matter in terms of sexuality, whether he was gay or straight. It doesn't really make much difference. As James Joyce put it 100 years ago, the artist, like the king, God of creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. Yeah. You guys having a good time reading what I wrote? Okay, it's not his business anymore. It's out there, and that's pretty much the way that we tend to look at literature these days, especially in the West. Roland Barthes' famous essay, La mort de l'auteur, the death of the author. Basically, the point is that once a work's published, the author is out of the picture. It's the relationship between the reader and the text that matters. What the author thinks is can't. Okay, and you know, we can very often see that. I mean, for example, I think the Bronte sisters wrote an awful lot of stuff that they weren't conscious of. And if they were conscious of it, they might have thought, hang on, wait a minute, I'm not sure if I want to publish this at all. Okay, especially something like Wuthering Heights. She gives out an awful lot about herself, unconsciously, but probably, which she's probably not aware of what she's saying about herself. So it goes right back to Socrates. You know, Plato and Socrates, it was the same thing. You know, when Socrates found out that he was the wisest person, the first thing that he did was say, no, there are lots of people who must know a lot more than I do. So he went and talked to experts in various fields. And one of the groups was, you know, writers of poetry and, you know, that sort of thing. And he found that mostly they had no idea about what they'd written. That they didn't understand their writing. They were a conduit for it. The inspiration would flow through them. But they really had no understanding of the implications of what they'd written or why what they'd written would be so effective and what effect it would have on the reader. They were just good at sort of letting it flow through them. Talk to them about it and you find they didn't really understand what they themselves had written. You know, and very often you get that kind of thing, like J.K. Rowling coming along at this point and saying, we're talking about homosexuality, she says, in my mind, Dumbledore was always gay. You know, and you sort of think, why do you have to mess things up? You wrote the books, you put them out there, now trying to tell us that Dumbledore is gay is like, you know, it's interfering with what you've written. You're spoiling things. Just leave it alone, okay? Let other people think about it and decide what they think about it. So, yeah, what does it really matter who or what the author was? The important thing is the relationship between the reader and the text. And yeah, it's not what his sexuality in itself was that's important. It's what his works tell us about sexuality, what they tell us about gender issues. Not what he felt, but what he makes his readers feel. That's what's important. Okay, so that's where I want to turn now and start looking in that kind of direction. We've already talked a little bit about last week about the Elizabethan stage So I'll just sort of reinforce some of those points. Basic one, obviously, being that all the female parts were acted by boys or young men. And, you know, I am going to leave aside Shakespeare's sexuality after this comment, but it does introduce another interesting possibility, that it's possible that for Shakespeare, the drama, the stage, was everything. It was just so perfect. Look at that Romeo and Juliet up there on the stage. That Juliet is more perfect than any woman I've ever seen. And yet it's a boy or a man. Okay? It may be that what he was attracted to was the stage woman. The boy dressed as a man, or the young man the boy dressed as a woman, or the young man dressed as a woman. That may have been what kind of struck him as being more perfect than any actual woman. All right, we couldn't really say, but the point is that it, that aspect to it was there. I want to get away though now from what he felt or didn't feel, what he thought or didn't think, and look at his works and see what they're telling us about gender. But the starting point would be that there is a tremendous amount of gender bending in the early modern period, particularly coming from this fact that on the stage, the men, the younger men would take the parts of women, of the beautiful young women. And of course, older men would take the parts of older women. So that's something that's outside his control, isn't it? That's something that the society has determined. I mean, we saw last week it was shocking even for a woman to go to the theatre. So she would very often wear a mask in front of her face to hide the fact that she'd been to the theatre, she was at the theatre, so she could sort of go anonymously. To be up there on the stage was clearly, no way. You can't go up there on the stage and perform in front of strangers. That would be a terrible scandal. So that actually didn't start happening until much later, towards the end of the 17th century. But, you know, that's outside Shakespeare's control. That's what the society has decided is okay or not okay. But Shakespeare himself is notable for playing with that convention. All right? Which, of course, there were similar conventions in Japanese drama, weren't there? I mean, when you had women acting in the drama, it got a bit too close to prostitution, so they prohibited it. And then now you've got the situation again in modern Japanese traditional drama, where the men are taking female parts. So it's always been a problem in different cultures. But for example, he complicates things by having an actor who is a man who comes onto the stage as a woman and then pretends to be a man. Okay? And so that really is playing around with the whole thing, isn't it? He's obviously fascinated by that side of things. So you've got, for example, in The Merchant of Venice, you've got Portia dressing up as a man, dressing as a judge. And her maid dresses up as an apprentice. And in the same play, you've got Shylock's daughter Jessica disguising herself as a boy, in order to run off with her Christian lover. Shylock is Jewish, and his daughter wants to leave her Jewish father and run off with a Christian. And to do it, she dresses up as a boy. And we've got it in Twelfth Night. Viola is probably the most developed, well, she is the most developed cross-dressing character. She takes on a disguise as a eunuch. Notice, not as a man in the full sense, but a man who has been castrated, who has been, he's had his balls cut off. Okay? And the reason that this was done was so that he would continue to have the beautiful voice of a boy. And this was actually done, the eunuch choirs of the Middle Ages and lasting, I'm not quite sure how long they went on in different parts of Europe, but this was done to preserve the beauty of a young boy's voice, they would actually be castrated. And she takes the part of a castrated male, a eunuch. She's pretending, because she's, it's all a very complicated story of why she's pretending. But the point is that while she's doing that pretending, she falls in love, she falls in love with the Duke, who thinks she's a man and therefore can't love her. All right, so she's in love with him, but she can't tell him, oh God, he thinks I'm a man and I'm so attracted to that side. On the other side, all right, we've got Olivia, who thinks that also thinks that she's a man, and she's thinking, oh dear, she thinks I'm a man, and she's falling in love with him. What should I do? Okay, so you've got the really, Shakespeare's really going for it here. He's really playing with the kind of gender ambiguities of Viola. And we get a further kind of gender bending with the woman as man in other ways, not just in terms of dress, but in terms of behaviour. So we've got quite a few plays in which women dress as men. We do have a few examples, not very many, but we've got one or two examples of men dressed as women. And it's interesting to notice that in Shakespeare's society, in early modern society, men dressing as women was not considered anything very serious. It was just like funny or something. Women dressing as men, now that was bad. Women could get into trouble. They could be whipped for dressing as men. Think about it. Men have the power. It's a patriarchal society. You're a woman, you have to know your place. You pretend to be a man. Oh boy, you're crossing a line there. So it's actually quite serious for a woman to pretend to be a man. But the other way around, it was considered more like something funny or something silly to do, as far as we can tell. And that could be that in the case of the very, very few cases of a man dressing as a woman, but one of them is in that early modern drama. Shakespeare gives us one example in Antony and Cleopatra. He might be echoing the Greek myth of Hercules. Again, Hercules, a very masculine man. You think of men, you think of Hercules, you think, wow, he's a hero, big, strong guy. But, he was forced to wear the woman's clothing of the Queen on Farley. And it may be that Shakespeare is echoing that in Antony, who is dressing up as a woman in Antony and Cleopatra. And something else that's really worth paying attention to, the fact that you get women, it's not just a question of their clothing, but it's the way they act and behave, that they actually take on the role of the man. So you've got Katharina in Taming of the Shrew, where she really is not going to be a Jose taking a Jose. I mean, her whole, she despises that kind of thing. She's, she's a powerful lady. Okay? The Taming of the Shrew, she has to be tamed by a man, and it's a kind of comedy about how that happens, which, again, depending on how it's interpreted, a lot of feminists would see it as, well, this is anti-women, he beats her, he starves her. But, I mean, she gives as good as she gets, okay, to be honest. She fights back in a very spirited way that makes you feel that their relationship is very spirited, very, very attractive relationship, because it's based on a kind of dynamic of you watch it, or you watch it, or it's a dynamic kind of thing. Whereas you've got the other two lovers in the story are sort of sitting there all the time holding hands and kissing, well, you don't get much kissing in the Shakespearean theatre, but you know, they're being very soppy. And by contrast, they're just not interesting. Right? So he seems to be showing that it's just much more interesting to have that kind of passionate, you know, power struggle going on within a relationship than just to be sitting there simpering and going on about lovey-dovey sort of things all the time. But you also get in Julius Caesar and Lady Macbeth two women who urge the murder of a king and who take on quite literally a man's role. Portia says, I have a man's mind. I only have the power, I only have the might in this case meaning power of a woman, but I have a man's mind. And Lady Macbeth says, unsex me here, take away my female sex and fill me with cruelty, because women are not supposed to be cruel. Take away my female sex, unsex me here, she says. So there's a very clear feeling of the woman taking on the man's role. All right, it always ends badly, okay? I mean, those two end badly, so there's a kind of moral there, you know, that you can feel that in the end Shakespeare is kind of saying, well, women should know their place. All right, but you know, we've got this image of the powerful woman, and it's quite striking. Okay. All right, this kind of, you know, the woman crowned with the crown, the woman sort of, kind of powerful image of a woman. Shakespeare seems to go quite a lot for this. And I think in the early modern period, the powerful woman was very much part of the culture, part of the society. It's a paradox in a way, because it's a patriarchal society. So how does this happen? How do you get a patriarchal society that's nevertheless got some very strong representations of powerful women? And then their power is seen as losing their womanhood and taking on a man's role. And you've also got some very powerful imagery of men losing their masculinity and taking on a feminine role. So you've got a lot of feminizing of men, and you've got a lot of sort of masculine representations of women. It seems to be a feature, it's very much a feature of the early modern period. It's something that, you know, if you're interested in gender studies, the early modern period is fascinating from that point of view. Okay, so we need to look at what was going on during Shakespeare's time, and how people saw women and how women expressed themselves and what role they had in society. And okay, let me just sort of get into the topic here and move things into things that we've already talked about, all right? A little bit. We've talked about how Henry divorced his wife and broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, and that was all because he wanted to have a son. But in the end, he had two daughters who both ruled as queen. I mean, he had a son who ruled for a short time, but he didn't live for very long. And his daughter Elizabeth was, you know, one of the most successful rulers that England ever had. Okay, perhaps. Actually, interestingly, you could say perhaps that Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria, and the second Queen Elizabeth, they're the longest lasting ones. Okay, and they also were queen in extraordinary times. So you've got this leader of the country who is a woman. Henry's son dying, and then his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, being named as his successor. She was queen, but only for 11 days, and then she was never properly crowned or anything. And poor woman, she didn't even want the job, but she had her head chopped off for it. So then Mary, the one Bloody Mary, as she's called, came into power, the Catholic Queen. And then after that, we had Elizabeth, and then, as you'll remember, Elizabeth's main kind of rival for power was her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. And Henry would have been probably very surprised, given that he placed so much emphasis on having a son. He would have probably been very surprised to know that the throne was occupied by women, and that women played such an important part in that period in the late half of the 16th century, the second half of the 16th century. Here they are. Okay, these women who, in the middle of a patriarchic society, took this position of power. And, of course, they were very symbolically important for the country. The idea that women were taking on those roles influenced the drama. It influenced the whole culture. So we'll just take a little look at them and remember just how important they were in shaping the society's conception of women. All right, so that would be part of it. The fact that there were these very powerful women actually, and as we saw when we looked at the history, their stories are more extraordinary than anything Shakespeare ever wrote. Their lives were quite extraordinary. But there's another way in which women stood out in those days, the fact that people were burned for their faith. Okay? Especially Protestants were burned by Catholics. And that this image of the woman as a martyr is very, very powerful image for the whole of the early modern period. Well, so from about the middle of the 16th century and through the 17th century. You find it in the poetry and the drama. The image of the woman as martyr is a very, very powerful image. And yeah, this is the first thing that is kind of new today, because we talked about the history and we talked about those four powerful women before, but the idea that this was a time when people could die and people were put to death for their beliefs, and that women were active in this. Mary, of course, shockingly involved in authorizing the burning of people. There's the Queen saying, burn him, burn her, burn them. Okay, you've got a woman actually doing it, right? But also you've got women on the receiving end, women who are being burned. And this all, the question of religion and the punishment that came to people for having the wrong religion is connected very strongly with gender issues. But those women, some of them died under Henry, who, as we said, was not really a proper Protestant, and he stuck to a lot of the Catholic ideas, so he burned reformers, he burned Protestants, and then his daughter Mary burned them as well. Anne Askew, one of the most famous of them, she was tortured and burned under Henry. And Shakespeare probably was thinking of her when he wrote of the death of Lavinia in Titus Andronicus. Titus Andronicus is one of Shakespeare's worst plays, He probably didn't write all of it himself. He worked together with other people, and there's some rubbish in it. But Lavinia is probably based on Anne Askew or one of the other female martyrs from that period. But it's not so much that that Shakespeare, writes in a kind of copy or a sort of fictional version of a real-life person. That's not the point. It's the way that the female identity is redefined by these female martyrs. There weren't a huge number of them, okay? I mean, there was, most of the people who were burned in this way were men. But the fact that there were women there, and that they faced their death with this incredible courage, many of them. According to Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was the sort of, next to the Bible, was the popular book of that period, the fact that they faced their death with such courage was giving a message. And the basic message was, hey, you men, can you not even suffer like a woman? Look at how those women faced their death. How can you complain? What kind of man are you? You're not even as much of a man as those women. All right? Can you see how this challenges gender roles? So this was actually used quite a lot by politicians at the time. To be a true man, you had to be able to suffer like a woman. And of course, martyrdom was one thing, but also, and that was exceptional, but women routinely suffered because childbirth in those days was a very dangerous and painful experience. Many women died during or shortly after childbirth and went through hours and hours of agony in giving birth to children. So this was used as a way of shaming men. All right, and we can see that again. We can find many examples of that in the literature of the period. Aren't you man enough even to suffer like a woman? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Okay, so that political oppression could be inflicted by, why are you complaining? Right? Even a woman can put up with more than you can. So it's like for men, when you're a little boy, you have this sort of dream of being a knight in armor, and you're going to go out, and you're going to be a great adventurer, you're going to kill dragons, and you're going to rescue women from little towers and things. Sort of that kind of image. Well, it's all being challenged. You're being told that, you're actually quite pathetic. Okay, so there was a lot of gender insecurity among men in that early modern period. Okay, even though it was a patriarchy, there was a lot of challenging of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. Okay, so men were feeling threatened by a kind of masculinity that seemed to be found in some women. And another important aspect of women in those days the woman as a witch. Okay. And I mean, yes, to us it just seems like a bit of fun. We dress up on Halloween and nobody thinks too much about it. But, in Shakespeare's day, people believed that there really were witches and that they were agents of the devil. And just for example, in the 1580s, 53 people were found guilty. They were charged with being witches. 11 of the 64 were let off, but 53 of them were found guilty. and put to death. All right? In one village, 53 people. Okay? And there were other cases going on all through England at this time. Witches were not just a joke or just some bit of harmless fun. Again, I'm revising here, reminding you of something we said before, which is that King James believed in witches. King James wrote a book about them, and that Shakespeare introduced the witches in Macbeth in order to please the new king who had come from Scotland. Sometimes men were accused of being witches, but mostly it was something against women, and we tend to see it from a modern perspective. We see it as a form of violence against women, that women were treated in that way. And again, it tells us something about what kind of society does that to women. It's going to have to be a society that's got a tremendous fear of women for some reason, in some way. So part of that would be because of religion, that it was Eve who was tempted by the serpent. It was Eve who took the apple in the Garden of Eden, in the Seishon no Hanashi in the Bible. So women were tempting men. Come on, Adam, try it. All right? Women were the ones who were leading men along the path into evil. That was the idea, that was the supposition. And that women were more easily tempted themselves, that the devil would enter a woman much more easily than a man. And you've got the moon and menstruation, the monthly cycle, the menstrual blood, the whole connection with the moon and with spirits and the supernatural, that women were somehow connected to all of that. And so there was a popular fear that women were inherently, naturally, more easily turned in an evil direction. They were more susceptible to evil than men. Just to clear up one or two little historical points, we always think of witches being burned, but not in England. Witches were hanged in England. Okay? Heretics were burned for religion. Okay? People who committed treason, that is the crime against their country, they were susceptible to being burned. All right? Especially women. Men had an even more terrible punishment, but I won't talk about it. But yeah, witches in England were hanged. And the other thing is that one of the tests, how do they decide if somebody's a witch? Well, they would put them to various kinds of tests. It was all to do with God wouldn't let a good person die. So if we tie her up and throw her in the river, if she's good, she'll float. Sorry, no. If she's good, she'll naturally sink. And we'll get her out before she dies because she's not a witch. If she floats, that's not natural. She's a witch. So the paradox would be that if she floats, we're going to take her away and burn her. If she sinks, if she's lucky, we'll get her out in time. But very often they wouldn't be able to get her out in time and she'd be dead anyway. So that's just how nasty it was. Okay? The test to see whether you're a witch or not could kill you quite easily. So, yeah, I put them as fun facts, but there's nothing funny about it, is there? It's not funny at all. It's pretty horrific. Okay? You've got this society where women were burned, women were tied up and thrown in rivers, women were hanged. Okay? You've got some pretty nasty, pretty serious stuff going on here. There's nothing really funny about it at all. It's not fun. I mean, these days we may treat it, witchcraft as a bit of fun or something like that, but you know, in Shakespeare's England, people believed in that stuff. It was real. And if we want to understand Shakespeare's age, we've got to understand, you know, these aspects of the society. Okay, so just to wind this up then and finish off, you've got a society in which there were powerful men who were challenging male hegemony, the patriarchy, and you've got brave women who were putting men to shame because they could die more bravely than men, or they could suffer pain more than men, and you've got the belief that women could lead men into evil. So you've got a kind of fear of women, you've got an insecurity, on the one hand admiration, on the other hand fear, and a challenge to your role, you know, to the role of the man. And, you know, of course, we can see from Shakespeare's plays, we can see from a lot of things in that period, that there were also relationships based on affection and trust. How could there not be? I mean, if not, how would people ever have got together and had families, you know, and lived normally? I mean, you know, I've shown the abnormal, the extraordinary things that were happening, but of course, you know, people were living ordinary lives, they were getting married, having children, doing the things that people have always done. So it's not what this tells us about Shakespeare that's interesting, it's what this is telling us about that society. It's about how Shakespeare's drama gives us a way of understanding that society, and not just understanding that society in particular, but also understanding gender relations in a general way, because the things that he writes about that were true then in that sort of society where they burned heretics and they hanged witches and where they did all these terrible things, very often involving women, we're part of the same humanity. Okay, we're still stuck in all of this. He's not giving us answers to particular problems, and that's one of the reasons why he is so great. And great artists don't usually give us answers. Okay, it's one of the mistakes that people have when they look at the Bible. They think it's got all the answers. It doesn't. It's got all the questions. You have to work out the answer. Okay? That's what great literature is about. From the Bible, through Shakespeare, to anything else you want to look at. If it's great literature, it's not giving you answers. It's asking you to think about it. It's giving you the questions. So that's really what's important about Shakespeare. Okay? We can question our attitudes, we can question our assumptions, we can think, oh, you know, what would I have done, you know, if my wife had been urging me to kill the king and the witches had told me, this is Macbeth, okay, the witches had told me I was going to be king, and my wife hears the news and says, oh great, you're going to be king, well let's kill the king then, and then you'll be king. Okay, what would any of us do? Would we be corrupted? Okay, can we be corrupted? Are we? What happens? There's so many questions, but no final answers. All right, again, we're back to Socrates, aren't we? What did Socrates know? What made him the wisest person? He knew that he knew nothing. He didn't have the answers. He had all the questions, though. All right? And he knew his way around all those questions. So this is really, I suppose that's Western wisdom, really. But there isn't a final answer to everything. It's all about the questions. It's the questions that keep us going. So it's not really a question of Shakespeare's own sexuality, it's a question of how he gets us looking at sexuality